And the way that data sufficiency works is you're actually given two pieces of data, and then based off of those pieces of data, you're asked to be told, I can solve this question with just this one piece of data, with just the second piece of data. I need both pieces of data together to solve the question. If I have both pieces of data together, that's not enough to solve the question. So those are the permutations that you see with data sufficiency. So again, a little bit too in-depth for me to get into in any great detail tonight, but I highly recommend that people spend some time with data sufficiency questions before they sit the actual exam. You'd be surprised by the number of people who sit down for the actual exam never having done a data sufficiency question, who score extremely poorly on data sufficiency, not because they aren't smart, but simply because they don't get how those questions work. So want to definitely point that out and emphasize that for any of you who are going to be taking the exam. And then the final section, after you get done with the AWA and with the math, is the verbal section. And the verbal section is also 75 minutes in length. You'll get 41 questions, so 4 more questions than on the math section. And this is divided up into 3 sections. The first is reading comprehension, the second is critical reasoning, the third is sentence correction. These questions will be interspersed throughout the test. So it's not like you're going to do all reading comp, then all critical reasoning, then all sentence correction. You'll see them in somewhat random order throughout the entire exam. Reading comprehension are they're pretty standard from what you've seen in the past on other standardized tests. Critical reasoning tend to be a little bit more in depth, definitely again like data sufficiency ones that you want to spend some time with, more thinking about arguments and that type of thing. And then sentence correction, they tend to be grammatical, but in addition to being grammatical, they're also focused on saying something very concisely. And one of the things that I did when I was running GMATtutor.com is actually went through, there's a book called The Official Guide to the GMAT, I believe. It's the official book with previous test questions, and I went through all of the sentence correction questions, and I actually charted them based off of the length of the answer choice. And what I found was actually pretty surprising, which is that the shortest answer wasn't right the most of the time. It was actually the second shortest answer that was right, more than any other of the answer choices. But when you started to get out to the 4th and 5th shortest, or the first or second longest answer choice, those fell way off in terms of how frequently they were right. And this was a really good data point, because as I worked with students and I talked to people about the GMAT, it was very obvious then that you could start to look at those very long sentences or very long sentence choices and say, you know what, it's a pretty good chance this isn't going to be the right answer. And occasionally it is. But when you look at the numbers, and I encourage you to take a look at GMATtutor.com, you'll see the information there. When you look at the numbers, you actually find that it's very unlikely that the longest or second longest answer choice is going to be the right one. So it's not just about grammar, but it's also about being able to say something in fewer words, basically. So a good little tidbit there. So how important is the GMAT? Well, the first answer is very important. As I mentioned before, with the GMAT, it's the one objective piece of data that admissions committees will have to look at in terms of whether or not you're going to get into business school. Almost everything else that you give them, for the most part, is going to be subjective. I mean, to some extent, if you had a 3.8 versus a 3.7 at Harvard, I mean that's an easy thing for business schools to compare. But for the most part, this is the only piece of objective data. So a better GMAT score is going to significantly help your chance of acceptance at a top business school. Now, one of the things that I always impress upon students is spending a lot of time studying for the GMAT is actually a very good investment, both of time and potentially of money. If you decide to take a course, if you purchase software or a book, you're getting into a better business school purely from a career earnings perspective it's a huge difference. And I think there's something like, over the course of someone's career, someone who gets an MBA is going to make I think it's something like $750,000 more than somebody who doesn't. And I think that number actually seems a little bit low to me, because when you look at starting salaries for people with MBAs, when you look at kind of the career paths, very, very different from someone with just an undergraduate degree. Now, so somebody who decides that business is their path and wants to do the MBA, I highly recommend to spend a lot of time and whatever money you can studying for your GMAT, because it is an important part of your application. And of course, your application determines whether you're getting into a top 5, top 10, top 20 business school. I'll talk a little bit in a second here about my experience with taking the GMAT and applying, because it isn't the be all and end all, but it definitely is a very, very important part. So one thing that's really important also to understand, though, is it's not everything. With the GMAT, you also need a strong overall application. So things like your essays, things like your recommendations, things like your work experience, things like your undergraduate transcript, all these things still matter significantly in terms of whether or not you get into business, the top business school. This is actually in contrast with law schools. With law schools, the LSAT is weighted much more heavily than the GMAT is for business school. If you have a top LSAT score, you're almost guaranteed to get into a top law school. There's some exceptions, of course, but in general, your LSAT score is extremely important. For business school, the GMAT is important. However, it's not the most important thing. There are other things that are looked at almost equally, maybe even more so, depending upon the admissions committee. Now, with the GMAT, one of the things that people will often think is, well, if I get a poor GMAT, is that going to disqualify me? And the answer is no. A poor GMAT won't disqualify you, and for a couple of reasons. First of all, you can always take the GMAT again. We'll talk a little bit about that later on. But also, I've seen a lot of people who've had strong work experience, they have strong recommendations, they do a great job on their essays, and they may have not the best GMAT score, but they still do get into a top business school. So it's important to understand that even though a good GMAT score will certainly help you, a poor GMAT score, as long as it's not extremely poor, is not necessarily going to disqualify you. Now, in my own personal experience with the GMAT, I gave you my scores before. I scored very high. GMAT's, for those of you who don't know, the max score is 800. So the 760 and the 770 that I scored was in the 99th percentile of all test takers. In fact, I think 720 maybe or 730 is actually the cutoff for being in the 99th percentile. So I scored very well, and I think that with that, I ended up thinking to myself that I was pretty much going to be a shoo-in for the top business schools, and to be honest, I actually didn't get accepted to several of the top business schools that I applied to, and that was a little bit of a bummer for me. But at the same time, where I got into school, I went to the UCLA Anderson School of Management, and it was a great business school, fantastic experience there. Wouldn't have traded it for anything else. It worked out great, but I think that it was kind of an awakening of sorts for me to realize that you can have a great GMAT score, and that's not going to guarantee that you get into a top business school. So just something to keep in mind as you go through the applications process. So now we get into computer adaptive testing, and this is where I want to spend a good chunk of time today. If you have any questions about this, we can definitely cover them tonight. It's a really important part of sitting for the GMAT. So first thing with computer adaptive testing is it's a new approach to testing. Typically in the past with the GMAT, with other exams, they were administered via paper and pencil. You were given a certain amount of time to complete each section. You'd have the ability to move around within the section. So you could skip questions, you could start at the end and work backwards. It didn't really matter with pencil and paper exams. With computer adaptive tests, it doesn't work like that at all. You're given a question, and you cannot move on to the next question until you answer the question that you are given. So a lot of people with computer adaptive testing, that throws them immediately. If they've never seen a computer adaptive test before, they end up getting a little bit frazzled because they say, I can't get the answer to this. I want to move on, but I can't move on because I have to answer the question. We'll talk a little bit about that tonight because that's a pretty common scenario, and it certainly shouldn't be something that causes you any anxiety on test day. Now, I actually think that computer adaptive testing is something that's favorable if you understand the system. If you understand how computer adaptive testing works, you should actually look at computer adaptive testing as something in your favor, because you have to understand that a lot of people who sit for the GMAT don't understand how computer adaptive testing works. So if you're sitting next door or next to somebody on test day and they don't understand how computer adaptive testing works and you do, you have an advantage over them. Now, the format itself might be a little tricky to understand, but I think it's a really important thing that if you get the basic knowledge down, then it's something that you should feel actually very glad that the exam is computer adaptive. And like I said before, it's one of the most important things to learn. So how does computer adaptive testing work? Well, the way it works is when you start out for the exam, the computer, which is basically judging what your score is going to be, has no idea as to how good of a student you are. You could be a 200 level test taker, you could be an 800 level test taker. The computer doesn't know. So what the computer does is it tries relatively quickly to figure out roughly what the range is that you should score. So what it will